2 years ago, I met a young woman at my church gathering who told me, I felt God touch me and everything has changed. Picture that moment for a second. The song, the life, and maybe the breath that feels like an answer. For some teenagers, this particular condition can lead them towards a lifetime of questions. But for the other, it could just be the final answer where the question stops. And I've been spending last year asking why actually the same moments can lead to two different contradictory paths. And why this actually matters to their life, to their well-being, and for this kind of citizens they will become. Good morning, parents, teachers, and friends. My name is Florencia Sharon, and I'm currently doing research on the influence of faith-based emotional satisfaction on Christian adolescents' critical thinking. So, the research subject of this study is late adolescence. Late adolescence, roughly 17 until 25 years old, is actually the decisive window. It is where identity begins to settle, when habits of thoughts take shape, and when the ways of young leaders, young people, young adolescents learn how to handle feelings and doubt became trouble. From the research, it is actually found out that many adolescents find real emotional satisfactions through prayers, worships, and testimonies, and also other spiritual practices. In this research, I call this with a term. It is ESSP, or emotional satisfaction derived from spiritual persons. For many people, ESSP is widely known as something that is powerful, it's immediate, and it is often life giving. But don't you know that the research actually shows that it can actually do quite two different things? First of all, it can either be a fuel for reflection or it can be a seal that closes off inquiries. So that trade off matters to mental well being, help seeking, and the habits of learning that schools and communities desperately needed. It touches SDG 3 on health and SDG 4 on quality education. So, to understand this dynamics on this research, I have designed a mixed method study with integrating the surveys as the quantitative data and the interview as the qualitative data. For the quantitative data, the surveys, I've collected 80 respondents in total, which are evenly split between mainstream Christians and Pentecostal Christians, with all aged between 17 until 25 years old. On the other hand, for the interviews, I've done a interview with 4 interviewees in total. These interviews have backgrounds in Christian psychology, theology, youth ministry, and also youth counseling. So, to explain what are actually observed from the research, I built a simple map of 3 lenses. So, the first lens, we have the identity lens. Emerson told us that adolescence is when who I am begins to crystallize. So, if a spiritual experience is becoming a defining moment, it becomes part of the story where they tell about who they are. And the second lens, we have the cognitive development or the reflection. So, cognitive development itself is the ability to step back, to weigh reasons, and to revise beliefs. Piaget, Dewey, and Colbert each point out to this growing capacity as to move from reactions toward reflections and to move from accepting authorities towards testing evidences. And then, last, we have the spiritual intelligence. So, Zohar and Marshall actually describes how meanings, values, and spiritual habits can actually sharpen judgments. Spiritual intelligence itself is the ability to take moral experiences or spiritual experiences and use it as a basis to make wiser and clearer choice in life. Now, try to imagine those three lenses actually interacting together in a simple psychological insight. Imagine you have two modes of thought. So you have the fast mode of thought, which is the feeling driven mode. And you have the slow mode of thought, which is the reflective mode. When ESSP comes in, for example, you experience a powerful worship. It can actually light up the fast mode of thought, the feeling driven mode. However, it could also channel these energies into the slow mode of thought, the reflective mode. And this is an important or essential part of it, where it becomes beneficial. Now, so how do these theoretical pieces actually play out in real churches? This is where denominational context takes place. So first of all, we have the mainstream Christians. Mainstream Christians' spiritual life often centers on first spiritual, second liturgy, and third conversations. Teenagers grow there with a culture that provides them with tools like text reads, mentors to ask, and also traditions that says, show me why, like why this and why that. And next one, by contrast, there is the Pentecostal Christian. So the Pentecostal Christian gives emphasis on embodied encounter and testimony. So if in Pentecostal Christian we're talking about the public expressions, the spirits movement, or like the testimonies that actually build experiences that it itself feels like a truth. It is actually interesting to note that in most cases, the felt experiences from the Pentecostal Christians, or maybe the reflective capacities from the mainstream Christians, can actually lead to a seal, or it becomes a final answer. Across the surface, we found out that most beings reported high ESSP, but they actually split into two kinds of groups. The first group uses ESSP as a springboard, but the another group uses the ESSP as a seal, which closes off the inquiry. So if you want to talk about quantitatively the ESSP actually predicted the spiritual intelligence or SI. And the SI or spiritual intelligence, in some circumstances, it supported the life satisfaction, especially in the Pentecostal context. However, ESSP itself does not directly predict the critical thinking, so it uses the spiritual intelligence and life satisfaction as a mediator here. So here are the details in the data. This is analyzed using the preferred regression analysis with experiential as a benchmark. Yes, so this is the pathway of thinking. So this is the framework. We work from ESSP. The ESSP supported the SR or the spiritual intelligence, and in some circumstances, it supported life satisfaction. And it was in these conditions when combined with reflective practices that it could make critical thinking more likely. And so by that, the human consequence is straightforward. When ESSP is channeled into learning, things develop resilience, things develop greater coping mechanisms, and also stronger habits of critical inquiry. However, on the other hand, when ESSP functions as a final validator, it could just close off the inquiry, to lower the help seeking, and reduce adolescents' openness. And to get further onto this, I get two insights. So first from the Pentecostal youth leader in KBT, Mawar, Helaginasi, told me when they are touched by that, the next step is a desire also. However, on the other hand, from the mainstream Christians, from GPIP Waranata, Pastor Adrian Sootnawidoban, he told me that we require a year of study, so the decision is not only emotional. So therefore, we can actually conclude something from here. There are two formation logics here. First one is encounter, and the second one is education. And both can actually bear fruit. Now, the task is integration. So what can be used for today? There are three skeletal steps. The first step is the personal ritual. So when you've experienced some kind of powerful worships, you can ask yourself these questions like, what has changed in me? Or what does that what questions does that feeling actually raise, and what one next step that I can take to learn more? You can utilize your sources that you have to be able to answer those questions. And second one is in community. So when in church communities or spiritual communities, spiritual leaders can actually pilot a reflection integrated study that reflection integrated study that pairs feelings with experiences that can help them to interpret what they feel and not just understand by their feelings only, but they know much more background study, much more background onto their feelings, and so that they can get deeper understanding on the gun. And the third one is the institutional support. So we want for policymakers and educators to fund trade that helps leaders combine pastoral care with open dialogues. So if you think nothing else, just remember this: worship does more than shape what peers believe, but it shares how they learn to think. Jesus says in Matthew 22, verse 37 that loving God needs to be also with mind, which means that we use the tools that God gave us to reflect, test, and apply the truth. So before you leave, just ask yourself this one question. After your spiritual experience, will you let it be the end of your questions or the beginning? Thank you. And yes, this is for the references. Yeah, I use this as a benchmark for the experiments, the experiments role for the before representation analysis. Thank you, Flo.